Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast by Sierra Club Canada about the environment in Canada. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, and today we're doing a follow-up on a previous episode entitled Resisting the U.S. Annexation of Canada Through Renewable Energy, Democracy, and Community. We got a lot of positive response to the episode and a lot more shares than we'd expected, and so it's pretty clear, perhaps for obvious reasons, this is a topic close to people right now. And as a result of that, we also got a lot of questions much quicker than we thought we were going to get for the episode, which we'll be answering here because, again, a lot of stuff is happening this month, and it's good to just get on this quickly. We might even have to do more episodes on just answering questions. But if you haven't already listened to part one, which is a previous episode, then I'd go back and check it out. Again, it's called Resisting the U.S. Annexation of Canada Through Renewable Energy, Democracy, and Community. It's also going to be added to this audio episode at the end if you just want to listen straight through. But probably best to go back and check it out first, because otherwise the questions I'm answering here are not going to make much sense without some context, probably. But here we go. Before we dive into the questions, we'll go to the normal intro to the podcast, but you can find out more about Sierra Club Canada at sierraclub.ca. You can find this podcast on pretty much any podcast platform of your choice, and you can also find more about us on social media, again, Sierra Club Canada. So the first question that we're going to get to for today's podcast is a set of questions that we got, which was around what would a U.S. annexation of Canada look like if it happened? Would we expect U.S. tanks in Ottawa in late January 2025? And the simple answer is no. I would not expect to see a U.S. force on the ground in Canada anytime soon. Would I completely rule it out in the future? Also, no, largely because we're entering a period of intense global insecurity and unpredictability, most likely. There are a lot of people in the United States worried about a conflict there. And if there are conflicts there, there's always a chance that's going to spill over the border, for one thing. And two, we don't know where things are going to be in a few years. And there's no guarantee that any of this stuff is going to be over in a few years' time. I don't think that that's something we should just bank upon. And so we just don't know. And I'm not going to make a prediction on that aspect of this one way or the other in terms of the longer term future. I don't think it's very likely in terms of this year or the immediate future that we would see anything like that. The thing that concerns us, and it prompted the episode that we did as a different form of attempted annexation, which we are already seeing some early signs of. Media being spread in Canada by the same people who normally spread climate denial and oil and gas corporate propaganda, calling for Canada to surrender to US statehood and claiming it's in our best interest to do so. We're seeing social media content being spread by these same voices that are normally very pro oil and gas corporation that's telling people that US statehood would be such a great thing and it's based in Canada. And that's what prompted us to do that episode. And on top of that, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the fact that that content was getting significant reach and likes. And like, if it had just fallen completely flat and there wasn't like a dedicated group of Trump supporters who we know already exist in Canada, not a big one, but still around, we probably wouldn't have done the episode. All of that, coupled with Trump's economic threats, which could deteriorate the standard of living in Canada, are something to take seriously, because there's a path to annexation there doesn't actually involve tanks or airplanes or troops. What we're seeing with misinformation spread in the past is that it does not need to actually convince the majority of Canadians to be effective. It just has to spread to a very vocal minority and then keep the majority of Canadians silent on the issue because they don't want to ruffle feathers, right? And a lot of people don't want to get into big arguments on any issue, and that creates a tension because even that small vocal minority can do a lot of damage that way, just by basically silencing the majority from speaking. For instance, recent polling shows most Canadians want action on climate change, especially when it comes to taking on big corporate polluters. But a vocal minority who don't want any action on climate change has convinced a lot of those who want climate action into thinking that they're alone when they are not, in fact, alone. When the majority of Canadians, 53%, want us to wind down oil and gas production and use in this country, and want government specifically to act on that. But again, that's the potential here for what a small vocal minority can do when they're given something like this. And that's why we decided to go forward with the particular episode that we did. Obviously, that's harder to do with an issue like Canadian sovereignty, right? People are going to get a lot more angry about that than they are about climate action, and that's just the case, and it's understandable why that would be the case. But the things politicians will do when they think they have license to do them, and again, that's something that small vocal minority can do, is like give license to politicians to make deals that seem like they're in the center of two different sides, but are in fact really tilted to the more vocal side, that impact is pretty wide-ranging. And we've seen that lead to some really terrible decisions on the part of Canadian political leaders in the past. And then at the same time, if you have a hostile US administration holding the economy hostage, that gives a lot of range for politicians to make really terrible deals that may not amount to, as we'll talk about, full statehood, but which are still really terrible for our sovereignty and could lead eventually to some sort of statehood down the line. And it brings us to the point that annexation doesn't need to be called annexation. Like most countries that annex another country don't call it annexation. In fact, you can see what Trump's saying is like uniquely clear on what his intentions are. And again, I've said this in the podcast before, I don't think it's worth taking those as a guaranteed bluff. And he does not actually tend to joke about what he actually wants to do. Even if we tend to take it as joking, that's not been the case in the past. And I don't see any reason why it would be the case with this, because again, it doesn't need to make sense in order for it to be something that he supports. So the idea of becoming a 51st state can be just as dangerous as formally actually becoming one if we enter into a bunch of agreements that seemingly leave us as a sovereign nation, but to actually hand away a bunch of power to Trump or his largely oil and gas CEO friends, or if we simply end up doing anything Trump or those CEOs want us to do for fear of reprisal. And at that point, we also become the 51st state, quote unquote. And in some ways, if Trump suddenly stops in the future calling us the 51st state or using that line, I'd almost be concerned that's because he feels he doesn't need to even say it anymore, that he just feels he has such a dominance over us and over our decision-making process that it's no longer necessary for him to use that line. So the idea of a 51st state thing is just as dangerous as the potential outcome. I still think the outcome is obviously one of the worst case scenarios, but that idea could erode a lot of national sovereignty just to begin with, and that could also be a slippery slope to something worse in the future. But our point with the episode wasn't to dwell on a worrying situation as much as to examine why there's a path out of it, at least from an energy perspective. If we can rapidly get off oil and gas dependence and localize power, employment, and supply chains via renewable energy, that puts us in a much better position to deal with hostile powers. That was the point of the episode. And there are a lot of benefits because we have seen repeatedly that oil and gas leaves us exposed to whatever is happening in the global marketplace. We can't domestically control energy prices very easily with it. We can't provide much stability, whereas renewable energy, most of the obstacles there can be overcome now with just implementation and doing things like energy grids in a way that provides communities with power, that interconnects different provinces. We can deal with issues when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. There's things like energy storage, there's things like energy efficiency. When Putin decides to invade a country and that sends the global energy marketplace into chaos because we're all reliant on oil and gas, we can't deal with that. When Trump threatens us with tariffs, we don't have control anymore over the energy supply or the employment supply. And things are so much better in terms of employment if we switch to renewable energy as well, that also helps to take care of a lot of problems that way. And we also wanted to provide individual people who are concerned about this issue with steps to take that actually help protect our sovereignty, no matter what Trump says or does in the future, no matter if he's bluffing or if he's not bluffing. Again, you might not be somebody who takes this seriously. And if so, fair enough. I mean, I hope you're right. But a lot of people do. And we saw that when we started reaching out on this topic with supporters, and leaving people with nothing to do that's beneficial doesn't help. And so providing people with actually, here's some concrete things, no matter where you fall on the seriousness of the 51st state thing, I would say it's worth taking seriously. You can do these things and they will be beneficial. Again, go check out our previous episode for things you can do to help oppose annexation in whatever form it might be proposed. It's worth doing. A lot of them are pretty simple. There's some other ones that involve like counter-protesting if it comes to that. And obviously those are really important, but go back and check out the previous episode. And so that ties into question 2, right? Which is around, does it make sense to address this issue at this point, or do we risk making things worse by taking the 51st state threat seriously? This is always a fine line, but for us, it comes down to looking at what's happening in the media environment and making a call. And if this had just been a weird statement by Trump that he hadn't started repeating, that we hadn't seen anybody in Canada repeat, then we probably would not have done these episodes. Also, we're seeing content online in Canada that's calling for an embrace of US annexation. And that content is getting hundreds of thousands of views and tens of thousands of likes. And at that point, it starts to become problematic. I mean, we've actually seen a small, super dedicated core of climate deniers start to organize around this issue. That's also problematic because that doesn't stay contained. At that point, I think it's time to face it, why we did the episode that we did. Because we've seen this pattern before of misinformation, usually backed ultimately by corporate interests, where it starts out small online with a few people and some content spreading really far and getting a lot of likes, and then becomes a bigger problem precisely because it wasn't addressed and countered early on, before it could spread. Because it was ignored, because nobody turned around and said, no, that's ridiculous. We're not joining the United States. We're not sacrificing any sovereignty, period. So by all means, call it ridiculous, but make sure you're getting the message out there that this is not going to happen and that it should not happen in any form, because again, it doesn't need to be official for this to happen. And it ties into our next question of why haven't mainstream media taken this 51st state thing as seriously? And first, I'm going to say that the coverage is different in the States than in Canada. In Canada, most coverage I've seen tends to cast this as a bargaining chip thing Trump is doing. And in the States, it's being taken more seriously. And it might be because journalists in the States have a slightly better idea of Trump and how he works, and that he tends to be serious about things he says, even if they sound ridiculous. I mean, another warning sign that led us to this podcast was how much Fox News was buying into this idea. Because if this is just a bluff, why try to actually convince Americans that it isn't? There's not much utility in that if it's just a bluff. But I think also this ties into a larger problem, which is that journalists in Canada tend to think these things go away if you ignore them, which is why we have seen time and time they get worse. The idea of ignoring misinformation or radicalization as a way to deal with it, I think, stems from an earlier period in which most people were informed by journalistic sources. Back then, yes, if you just ignored something, it would kind of go away on its own because the media cycle moves on and those journalistic sources go on to something else, or it gets discounted pretty quickly and then it moves on to something else, doesn't keep coming back. But we live in an age of social media where these things spread online first and gain traction there, only later making it to the media. And there's lots of follow-up social media content that keeps reinforcing these ideas with people. And that keeps the idea growing without any need for news media to cover it until eventually they can't ignore it anymore and then they need to start covering it. Way too late, we see a response from mainstream media along the lines of, oh, wow, this is bad. A significant group of people believe this stuff. Maybe not a majority, but maybe a significant enough minority that it's getting to be a problem. And then they'll come out with something like, here's what's wrong with that. And you might get like a fact sheet from journalists that doesn't do much because it came way too late. It came like after people had already been listening to this a lot. And it's depressing that most mainstream media sources have not seemed to figure out how radicalization and misinformation spreads in our contemporary age, which also explains why they don't really tend to take what Trump says seriously until it's actually already happening. And time again, we've seen this happen with Trump and with the media's coverage of other leaders like Putin, that they're portrayed as bluffing, and then suddenly they're doing something serious. That doesn't help anybody. It doesn't stop an issue from spreading, especially not anymore, because power is not in the journalistic media. It's balanced between that. Not to say that journalism doesn't do anything, but there's a lot of power now in social media that doesn't need to adhere to that media cycle anymore. That's, of course, tied in as well with reduced journalistic capacity, especially less funding of investigative reporting. The fact that a lot of media outlets have ties to corporate and US sources, I hate to say it, ties into it and the sort of coverage that they do and what they take seriously versus what the evidence says. Because I've seen increasingly in journalistic coverage, and this has always been there to an extent, this narrative thing where facts and reality tend to get twisted into what is the narrative that everybody's just accepted. And that narrative tends to be kind of homogeneous across a bunch of different media sources, as opposed to one source goes this way with it, one source goes another way with it. They're investigating the facts and they're changing whatever the story is based upon the facts. And I just don't see that in a lot of corporate-owned media outlets. And I mean, there's media outlets I do respect a lot, right? But we're at a point where even CBC is taking information from climate denial think tanks like the Heritage Foundation at face value on this issue, which is depressing. And it's not a sign of objective investigation. In fact, it indicates that at least some of their journalists are not equipped to deal with this kind of thing. Again, lots of great journalists at those outlets. CBC is a great news source overall. But this is why we suggest checking out some independent news sources that often go after misinformation issues earlier on and do take them credibly and do try to investigate because they understand better how social media works. So another question we saw was, wouldn't it be impractical to add Canada as a US state? Or wouldn't that mean adding a bunch of new US states, like one for every province and territory? Would it not be in the best interest of Americans and Canadians alike not to do this? So yeah, it would not be in our best interest for sure. I don't think it would be in the average American's best interest. It would not be practical. Why would that stop Trump and his CEO friends from trying? Most of the things he wants to do in America are impractical and bad for the average American. He's not acting out of the interests of his own country. He's not a patriot. He cares only about his ideas and what he's got in his head and what his corporate buddies are saying. Cough, cough, oil and gas corporations and healthcare companies, cough, cough. That is who he's acting in the interest of. And those interests don't align with the American people. They don't align with the Canadian people. And they don't even need to make any practical sense from a national standpoint. Oil and gas corporations do not know borders to begin with. As we talked about, nothing even the quote-unquote domestic oil and gas companies in Canada have planned for the future is actually good for Canadians or Canada's sovereign interest. It's about them and their profits, and no matter the chaos or the pain those profits cause or cost the Canadian taxpayer, they want to do certain things. What I mean by that is that they know the demand for their product is going to peak. They know there's no business case for a lot of projects like East Coast LNG. But if they get a government in power over Canada that they can control, then none of that matters. Canadians will foot the bill for these projects, even though they end up hurting us through subsidies while reaping no actual benefits, and oil and gas corporations will just run off with the profits because this is what they do. They've done this before in lots of other places. They've done that here. I see no reason why they wouldn't continue doing that. They've shown no moral reflexivity to turn around and go, well, that's a step too far around anybody else's national sovereignty. I don't see why they would do that around ours. And foreign companies versus domestic companies, sorry, they're all in the same lobbying groups. They all work together and they all work out of profit interest. And those interests just don't align with, they can, right? Like the profit interest of a company can align with national sovereignty. And for a while, oil and gas did. And that did have benefits for Canada. And it would be ridiculous, as I said before, to discount that. But yeah, they just don't anymore. If these corporations can lower the agency of individual Canadians through an erosion of our sovereignty, that is a net benefit to them. Oil and gas corporations are the ones parroting Trump's talking points and even directly supporting him while claiming to be on Canada's side. And hey, gotta assume there's a bunch of private healthcare companies that would love to see our public healthcare system collapse. Not something we talked about in a previous episode, but worth mentioning. And that leads to the next half of that question about if Canada joining the US would then give us as Canadians more power over the US government. And again, here I would ask, why would anybody think that? Like, sure, let's consider a different world where we're hypothetically talking about merging with the United States under a rational US administration for some reason. I don't know why we would, but for some reason, then okay, you might see proposals like every province becoming a state or a Canadian state getting a bunch of power over a new united country because there'd be some discussion of fairness in that agreement. But with the world that we are in, the one where we live, where this 51st state proposal is being made, we're not talking about people who play fairly here. We're talking about Trump. You know, we're not talking about some sort of fair arrangement here. We're talking about something that would be proposed in the context of huge economic threats at the very least. And so it's not an agreement that we're making where we get to negotiate. And Trump is not saying, let's add a bunch of new states from Canada. He's saying, add one Canadian state. And if we've gotten to that point, why on earth would we believe that deal would be fair? We have roughly the population of California. So at best, that's the level of power you'd be left with. And I think that's being optimistic. I think at that point, if we have sacrificed that much of our sovereignty that we actually truly considered becoming a US state, or that our leaders did, not necessarily Canadians, again, those two things are different. If we've given into that much to Trump, we're looking at something more like a territory of Canada with much less rights under a US system. Why would they make us a state at that point? And again, I don't think that's where we're at now. Our podcast is about preventing us from ever getting to that point, regardless of what Trump says or does, regardless of if he's bluffing or not. I, again, would not count this as bluffing, but even if you think he's bluffing, let's do something about this now. Let's put this to bed now. And on that note, I get why this is going to be a sensitive topic, and one, frankly, that a lot of people, myself included, do not want to have to talk about or would rather ignore. I was born in the early 90s, and like many North Americans from that time period, people have this false sense of security. I had this false sense of security in the back of my head on a subconscious level, as if history had sort of ended and stability was something that we would always come back to regardless of what went wrong in the world. So even in the early 2000s, when things were going pretty bad around the world, there was a sense that at some point we'll get back to stability. Haven't experienced that since, same feeling or comfort. And when I started getting into reading about history, and I eventually did my undergrad in historical studies, I realized pretty quickly that, for one, I was pretty lucky to live in a place and to be a person who I could experience that sense of security even for a time. And two, there's nothing in history to suggest that stability I felt is real or secure. And in turn, that belief that sort of history has ended, I think, has caused a problem in making us less active in our communities in a way that is proactive about issues like this. Whether that's being involved in politics or policy, often people are sort of averse to wanting to get involved in those things, but they are vitally important. And struggles to maintain national sovereignty have been won against far greater odds. I mean, my grandfather survived the Blitz in London as a kid. I think that we are not facing anything even remotely similar to that. A lot of the things, as we talked about in the podcast, come down to just shifting our energy system to something that's better and that we can localize. And by contrast, that struggle is super easy. Still difficult at times, but much, much easier. So there are a lot of reasons to have hope and to get involved. And I don't want to be pessimistic about the future here, because I do think we can build a good world to live in for all. I mean, that's part of our mandate as Sierra Club Canada. I just don't think we can do that by ignoring problems that are systemic, things like inequality, things like climate change, or by ignoring bullies like Trump. We are already making choices about border control and climate action in Canada that are based not on what the Canadian public want. Again, recent polling shows the majority of Canadians want strong climate action here, especially on corporations, but based upon what Trump and his oil and gas CEO friends tell our leaders to do. You don't defeat bullies by sacrificing the climate or sovereignty of our nation to appease them. That just encourages them to take more. We might well see a time when the future leaders of Canada are in a much different mindset. A lot of push from a small minority of pro-annexation people here in Canada, and also a corporate push from here in Canada and a corporate push from the United States for some sort of merger or at least some sort of agreement that is very good for us, and then a lot of pressure from Trump himself. And there is a chance that those leaders will try to sell us some form of palatable annexation as a solution, and it will not probably be, again, labeled annexation. All of Canada's leaders must utterly reject this, because this is a slippery slope to losing more and more power. I would encourage you to call out this pro-annexation garbage, as I've said, loudly and clearly now, because no matter what our leaders say, no one is coming to save our sovereignty but ourselves. I'll cite again the example of the Ottawa convoy occupation. The only thing that successfully countered that convoy occupation was when local people came out for a counter-protest, stood in the path of convoy participants, and told them peacefully and firmly, go home. I've been to those sorts of counter-protests before, and I've learned two things. Trump's advocates in Canada do not care about Canada and will believe whatever he says, no matter how ridiculous you and I might think it is. Letting them know they'd be peacefully opposed was effective, and it needs to happen every single time they show up somewhere. So here we are, dealing with something that none of us should have to deal with. And on that note, we will play the original episode as context to this one now and take some pretty simple steps and start organizing in your community the moment you hear anything about any of this coming home, because getting out there sooner rather than later is the best way to deal with these things these days. It is not good to ignore them. It's not good to leave. It is not going to change their credibility. Their credibility is going to be determined on social media for the most part by people who are going to push for this to be a credible idea when it shouldn't be. Thank you. I hope this has been of use. Hopefully, I would love to never have to do another episode on this subject, but getting the feeling we might have to. Previous episode starts now. That those most opposed to climate action are also those who want Canada to surrender into becoming a US state is unsurprising. US conquest has usually happened as a result of the influence of oil and gas corporations, and the interests of Canadian national sovereignty and those of oil and gas corporations are increasingly going in separate ways. Welcome to a special edition of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast by Sierra Club Canada. I am your host, Connor Curtis. Today's episode is on resisting the US annexation of Canada, or rather we should say the annexation of Canada by the oil and gas corporations behind Trump's approaching US administration. Given the importance of this topic, we are skipping our normal introduction. Suffice it to say, you can find out more about this podcast on your platform of choice, and you can find more about us at sierraclub.ca or on social media via Sierra Club Canada. From the second Trump mentioned the idea of Canada being a US state, it should have been clear he was not joking. People may laugh at some of the things he says, and the things he says may seem ridiculous, but he is a man who does not actually joke about his intentions. If you think it can't happen, look at all of the things we were told could not happen and have happened, how far reality can be stretched, and what people have been convinced to believe about climate change, about health, and about world politics. The idea that Canada could be annexed by the US might seem ridiculous. But if you checked out what the most ardent climate deniers here in Canada are saying, it becomes clear that an attempt to make this happen is already underway. It is an attempted annexation being fought not with troops, tanks, and fighter jets, at least not yet. It is an annexation being fought with words, images, digital bots, social media, and media relations. The way Trump talks about Canada is the way China talks about the regions it wants to annex, and it's the way Russia talks about the places it wants to annex. And that should be disturbing enough to us. It's a way of talking that implies we are already annexed, that we have already lost any distinct identity, already in Trump's minds and words, and in the minds of those corporations that support Trump. We are a US state. We are going to talk at the end of this podcast about what you can do to resist US annexation. But first, let's talk about why the annexation calls are coming from the sources that they are coming from. The idea of Canada becoming a US state should be a bad joke. But instead we are seeing calls for a Canada-US statehood movement from the same accounts and personalities that normally spread corporate oil and gas propaganda. There is no joke here, and it's more than just coincidence that these are the voices we are hearing this from. Oil and gas corporations have not only made this situation possible, but stand to profit from the erosion of Canadian sovereignty directly. More importantly, they have directly backed President Trump financially and continue to back him and to spread his ideologies here in Canada through sympathetic voices. Trump has promised these corporations directly that he will stall renewable energy growth and drill for oil and gas without limit or consideration for environmental or social impact. Oil and gas corporations may continue to try and convince Canadians they are on our side with their official direct corporate voices. In reality, they are actively funding and promoting the voices most opposed to continued Canadian independence. They have also been funding climate denial and delayism for years, knowing that the result would be increased social instability and a likely shift towards totalitarianism. And we should not be surprised. Oil and gas companies have shown zero restraint in supporting totalitarian governments or annexations when it has been in their best interest to do so in the past. These corporations show zero regard for those who will suffer as a result of climate change. It should be no surprise that Canada is not special to them. Because oil and gas corporations are motivated by profit. For a time, the self-interest of these companies did legitimately align to some extent with the interests of Canadian national sovereignty, and it would be foolish to say there have been no benefits for our country for workers that were derived from oil and gas. But increasingly, the profit motives of oil and gas corporations no longer align with the national best interests of Canada, and oil and gas corporations are aware of this. We've gotten into this subject with several economic and energy experts on previous episodes, but here's a quick summary of why Canada's interests and these corporate interests no longer share the same goal. Firstly, many of their proposed oil and gas expansion projects in Canada, like East Coast gas export facilities, have no business case unless they also receive huge sums of money from Canadian taxpayers in support. In the United States, the Department of Energy has warned that unfettered exports of gas would increase wholesale domestic natural gas prices by over 30% by 2050. In Canada, the International Institute for Sustainable Development writes, quote, "The economics for new LNG production are weakening. As demand is estimated to have already peaked in advanced economies such as Europe and South Korea, LNG demand growth in emerging Asian markets is also projected to slow." We already contribute huge amounts of taxpayer money to prop up oil and gas corporations. Thus, even though oil and gas corporations, while only 5% of our national economy, represent around 30% of our national emissions. For these future projects to succeed, the support would need to grow significantly and would leave Canadians footing the bill for these oil and gas projects, while their only real benefactors would be the corporations involved. Secondly, oil and gas are terrible energy sources to rely on if a nation cares about sovereignty. Unlike renewable energy, they are hard to localize, meaning the source of the energy you use is not near the site of use. Whether it's in terms of jobs, transport, or electricity, this leaves oil and gas dependent nations subject to international market volatility and thus to the whims of hostile powers. We saw this recently in Europe following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it has now sparked a rapid transition away from gas and towards renewables in the European Union. The price you pay for energy under oil and gas is also determined by the global marketplace, and realistically therefore by what international oil and gas corporations decide they can charge you. The energy price you pay for is not largely determined right now by domestic policies or local infrastructure, giving you much less power over the energy you use and what it costs you. Oil and gas corporations have seen huge profits, over $10 billion in the first half of 2024 alone, while Canadians, by contrast, are facing hard economic times. As of 2023, for every additional dollar of inflation in Canada, 25 cents of that goes to oil and gas and mining extraction profits. The majority of those profits, in turn, go to the richest 1%, and very little of those profits end up in things like pension funds. We can easily find renewable solutions for when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine by diversifying our energy grids, building connections between communities and provinces, building up electricity storage, and investing in energy efficiency. All those things also mean localized job creation, and if done right, mean communities gain more control over their energy supplies. The volatility of oil and gas can't be fixed domestically or locally, no matter how much money you pour into its development or how supposedly ethical the development is. Dependency on oil and gas also means energy workers need to travel far from their families for extended periods, and that we have to burn a huge amount of fossil fuels just to transport more fossil fuels to the location where it is needed. Oil and gas are incredibly inefficient sources of energy. You burn a lot of oil and gas just to move other oil and gas around. Thirdly, the energy race just isn't about oil and gas anymore, it's about renewables. Right now, globally, China is leading the way on cornering the supply chain for renewable energy equipment and related technologies. In many parts of the world, China now calls the shots on energy. If we want to secure our place in that marketplace, Canada must develop its own domestic renewable energy supply chain, something we are fully capable of doing. This is something we must do if we want to compete with countries like China and win the fight for future energy independence. Think about it this way. If competing with countries like China on energy is the new space race, then renewable projects are rockets and oil and gas projects are biplanes. You don't win a space race with biplanes. A lot of other countries, especially in the quote-unquote global south, are developing clean tech at paces ahead of North American countries. They are doing this because they want energy independence and because it makes sense. No leader in their right mind saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then said to themselves, seems like relying on natural gas is a good idea. Renewables make sense if you want sovereign control over energy. By contrast, in Canada, even when the production of oil and gas has increased recently, actual employment has fallen, as have royalties and the share the oil and gas industry plays in our economy. Oil and gas does not result in as many jobs as renewables, and again, the main obstacles for renewable energy in Canada are a need for more workers to fill positions and hostile policies that hold renewables back. There's been a lot of talk about data centers as of late and how their growth means increased energy demand. In Canada, if that demand is filled with renewable energy, the benefits are again localized. If it is filled by oil and gas, the benefits will largely evaporate into corporate profits. Fourthly, in terms of our list of reasons that corporate interests no longer align with Canada's interests, technology alone isn't enough to make a renewable future happen. We know this because the technology is largely already there in terms of renewables. What matters is the implementation of it. While provinces like Alberta occasionally mention they plan to invest in renewable technology development, the reality is their policies do everything they can to stall renewable growth. Because every power source that shifts from oil and gas to renewables is one less source of profit for oil and gas corporations, whose lobbyists spend huge amounts of time attempting to block renewable energy. The coming U.S. administration is promising to do everything in their power to stall renewable energy growth and alternatives and to bring back oil and gas dependency, something most Canadians would never actually agree to. These corporations are also aware that most Canadians do want action on climate change, are for renewable energy development, and no matter what happens in the next few years, are also waking up to the idea that oil and gas is the fuel of the past, and what is good for an oil and gas CEO is not good for Canadian workers or our economy. Indeed, recent polling by Abacus Data via Environmental Defence from December 2024 shows 53% of Canadians want governments to phase out the use and production of fossil fuels, while only 36% are opposed. Attacking Canadian climate policies like the emissions cap, which would spur green innovation and hold big polluters accountable, was a natural first step for oil and gas corporations. Because while oil and gas companies may talk about green innovation, history proves they fail entirely to innovate without strong regulations to hold them accountable to pollution. But they know that stalling domestic policies aimed at holding them to account is not a permanent solution, especially not when everything that is in the economic favor of Canada and Canadians is increasingly not the same thing as what profits oil and gas corporations. For these corporations, half measures and compromises are merely means to an end, a way of getting us to shed away principles like environmental protection, principles which can help us build localized power. You can see the thinking here and why oil and gas corporations would want us to become a US state. Direct control of Canada by a sympathetic US government would solve the problems of oil and gas corporations in one step. A US leader who can act legally as a king now, and who is hell-bent on blocking renewable energy development is a ticket to further profits for them. So why not put him in charge of Canada too? And even if all oil and gas CEOs are not necessarily on board with the complete annexation of Canada, they're certainly seeing the potential benefits of our sovereignty being reduced. And this is where it's important to point out, annexation doesn't necessarily need to be official. it also doesn't need to be done in one single step. A good litmus test for whether or not we are in fact maintaining independence is whether or not we are doing any of these things that are in our economic self-interest as a country, or whether we are simply letting big polluters do whatever they want to do without any restraint on their pollution. Those who annex countries usually don't use the word annexation when annexing them. By contrast, standing up for principles, whether that is for environmental protection or inclusivity, is our only way to prevent the erosion of our sovereignty, regardless of how you define that sovereignty. Because only through distinct identity and definition can a group survive annexation. And that doesn't mean buying into a hyper-nationalistic ideal or adhering to an image of a singular Canada. It just means placing ourselves apart from the beliefs of the next US administration and maintaining that distance. We're going to chat here a little bit about what you can do to oppose a US annexation of Canada, and here are some important steps. Step 1. Stand by principles that set us apart from the Trump administration and continue to push for renewable energy independence from oil and gas. Understand this threat to sovereignty is very real, but it can be opposed. The faster we get off oil and gas, the better off we'll be in terms of national independence. The fight for climate policies that hold big polluters to account and for renewable energy is vital to our continued sovereignty. We also have to stand by our principles, the things that define us as different from the US administration. Those principles include caring about environmental protection, holding big polluters accountable, and inclusivity and justice for the marginalized. In recent history, the US does not actually have a very successful track record of annexing other countries, at least not in the long term, and where they have been successful, it has largely come down to breaking the other country's sense of independent identity. The US, where it has won, has done so by preventing other countries from doing the things that help that country be more independent. In Canada's case, our energy path lies at the heart of our independence. Step 2. Understand that no one is coming to save us other than you yourself, and get organized. Organize across the spectrum of peaceful resistance and organize in your community now. It is better to be prepared early on for an onslaught of corporate-driven US propaganda than to leave it for later. This might mean working with existing groups in your community who are countering this propaganda or establishing new ones where others don't already exist. Calling out the garbage meant to convince Canadians to sacrifice our sovereignty or the things we believe in is more important now than ever. During the convoy occupation of Ottawa, one of the only things that actually proved effective was when counter-protesters calmly and peacefully told the incoming convoy participants to go home. Some people are already falling for the annexation propaganda. They need to be made aware calmly and peacefully that they are alone in their beliefs and that the rest of us do not want annexation. We'll have a link to full spectrum resistance thinking that you can check out below, as well as a link on how to talk to others about climate issues that may help. Step 3. Continue clear communication with the Americans you know to counter propaganda they may be hearing. I've met many Americans, and I've never truly sensed in the individual American a desire to invade or conquer others. When Americans have supported their government's foreign annexation attempts, it has been because they thought these actions were in the name of liberation or defense. A concerted effort will be made to try and convince the US public that Canadians want to be part of the United States. Ideas will be floated that will be made to sound reasonable, but which are stepping stones to annexation. Those ideas must be opposed publicly and peacefully, both in Canada and in the United States. Reach out to any US friends you have and make it clear to them that we do not want to be a US state, and that anything they hear on social media or in the news that suggests we do want to become a state or sacrifice our independence is a lie. Ask them to tell other Americans this and to call out any of their fellow Americans who claim Canada wants to join the United States. Step 4. Continue communicating with those in oil and gas dependent communities and provinces. You might be surprised to learn that support for things like climate action remains high even in places like Alberta. Indeed, many Albertans are actively fighting foreign coal interests that want to undermine local democracy there. Reach out to your contacts in these places and make sure they're also aware of what is happening. Step 5. Get online, but start creating backups. The digital world is an important place to communicate, and wherever voices are promoting annexation, we must be there to oppose it. It means sharing content, liking posts, and all of the above, but understand also that American companies control a lot of our social media. Developing lines of communication between each other that do not rely on social media sites is also important, whether that's in person or through different channels online. The same is true of mainstream media outlets. By all means, write letters to the editor, send media releases if you're part of a group, and always try to reach out to journalists, but stay informed via media sources that are not controlled by US conglomerates. Even very trustworthy sources sometimes make mistakes. I read a falsely comforting piece recently in CBC suggesting that all this US state talk by Trump is just intimidation towards negotiating better trade deals. This article quoted heavily supposed experts connected to the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, both of whom are climate denial groups. Since those connected to climate denial on social media seem pretty happy about the idea of Canada becoming a US state, I'm not convinced our mainstream media apparatus is thinking clearly on this topic, and I'm not convinced that they will be seeing this issue clearly in the near future if the climate denial groups are the ones that they are listening to.
Oil and gas industry think tanks are saying with one hand, don't worry about annexation, while the most ardent climate-denying supporters in Canada are being convinced to think of annexation as a good thing.
Mainstream media, sadly, has a habit of asking the fox what it plans to do with the chicken house and taking that as truthful. We will have a list of other independent media outlets, which I will link to below. There are many great journalists working at large organizations, but sadly, the newsroom can ultimately be controlled by owners, and editorial stances at those news outlets tend to fall for corporate propaganda lines on a regular basis. Step 6. Support or establish networks of mutual aid and support in your community. If the US government tries to use economic leverage against Canadians, then these networks, whether they be food banks or cooperatives or local community support groups, will become more important than ever. In closing, the people of the US and of Canada have a great deal in common. We are not enemies, and at the best of times we are great friends. Sierra Club Canada has a sister organization in the United States with whom we get along well and who are filled with great people. But we are not a chapter of their organization, nor are they a chapter of ours. And they do not ask us to become a chapter because they respect our autonomy, just as most Americans respect Canadian autonomy. That the greed of a few corporations has put us in this situation, both intentionally and unintentionally, where Canadian sovereignty is challenged, goes against anything the average Canadian or American actually believes in. Threats of annexation are, to quote a certain US president, sad, but they can and will be opposed.
Thank you for listening in to the Environment in Canada podcast. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.